Hi, and welcome to the Complaining Cow Consumer Show with me, Helen Judith, on East London Radio. And today I am very pleased to have with me Judith Turner, who is the Deputy Chief Ombudsman of Dispute Resolution Ombudsman, which runs the Furniture and Home Improvement Ombudsman and Rail Ombudsman Service. Judith, welcome and thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me. Thanks, Helen.
Well, let's get straight to it. Just tell us a bit about what it is the Dispute Resolution Ombudsman does.
So Dispute Resolution Ombudsman operates schemes across several different sectors, including furniture and home improvement, where consumers can bring claims against traders who supply goods and services within that sector. We also operate in the rail sector. So we operate the Rail Ombudsman, where again, passengers and consumers can bring claims against rail service providers in that sector as well.
Let's talk a little bit about the Rail Ombudsman, which you've been running for a few years now. What are the most common complaints that you see through that?
Yeah, so we see complaints about delay repay compensation, so things that happen under what they term industry arrangements, so where you are delayed and you're entitled to compensation from that scheme. So again, we see complaints arising out of whether or not the right amount, etc., has been awarded. Also, more broadly than outside of the industry arrangements as well, we look at complaints relating to complaint handling, so how the rail service provider has dealt with the complaint that the consumer brings to them. The provision of information is another example, and we also look at claims arising out of things like failed passenger assist, so accessibility, as well as those sorts of things that people experience on the railway in terms of facilities and services.
So, I mean, that's quite interesting about the delay repay, because I mean, that's pretty standard, straightforward, fill out all the information, pretty clear. If you're over the time of, the 15 minutes or the half an hour delay, whatever it may be, it should be standard practice that you get the refund. So what kind of things are you seeing that are going wrong?
Obviously, there are certain different thresholds for delay repay. So it might be that people feel that they're entitled to a greater proportion of their ticket cost back, depending on the delay that they've had. Also, different legs of the journey that might be operated by different rail service providers. Because remember, you can travel the length and breadth of the country with different train service providers on one ticket. So it might be confusion over where that delay kicks in and who's responsible for the delay repay, for example. Also, timings, people who think that they were delayed over the threshold, but the data that comes out of the industry shows that it was within. So again, we have those sorts of complaints as well.
Do you think that there is quite a lot of confusion around delay repay?
It is a generator of complaints for us, and it is always within the top level of those complaints, in terms of where it sits in the tables, if you look at the data that we publish. So I think, probably still is a degree of confusion there.
Do you work with the rail companies at all in improving their service and their information?
Yeah, so one of the remits of an ombudsman broadly across whichever sector they operate in, be it financial services or one of the public sector ombudsman, for example, we all have a remit to work with that sector and that industry to help deal with any issues there. We make recommendations as part of our decision making, where we can provide that feedback back to either an individual service provider or to the industry more broadly to help improve things, like, for example, the information and the way in which it's presented.
And how do you feel that the companies are in sort of taking that feedback from you and making changes? Have you seen any changes happen because of the work that you've done with them?
We have seen some changes, both on a granular level, with an individual train operator improving the information that it's got in its charter, for example, and more broadly that they do engage with those recommendations. And also, from our perspective, if something isn't possible that we're recommending, it's important that we get that information as well, systems changes, etc. We do get that feedback.
I don't know if you're going to be able to answer this, but are there any other providers or some providers that are clearly worse than others that you see more complaints about than other companies?
There is data that we do publish on that. I think it can be driven by a number of reasons, though, rather than just performance. So it is difficult to answer that question in a broad stroke.
Do you, when you see sort of complaints coming in about complaint handling, give me a couple of examples about the complaint handling complaints that you
Yeah.
you receive?
So it might be things like somebody's received a standard letter in response to something that was quite specific, and maybe that standard letter wasn't, or the person complaining didn't think that was appropriate. Or it might be about timescales, because there are kind of target provision about the days in which people need to be responded about. So it could be about the delays in complaint handling as well.
And what kind of decisions or awards do you make if you see in favour of a customer's complaint about complaint handling?
It might be an explanation as to why something went wrong. It's not necessarily a monetary award. We'd have to look at whether we thought there was some sort of detriment caused by that. So it's not uncommon to see apologies and explanation about why things went wrong, so that people can understand what the process was. Because sometimes it is just about, across lots of different ombudsman sectors as well, I think probably would pick up, it's not necessarily about what may have gone wrong, it's also about the process and the aftercare as well, that can be quite important for people to understand how it's been dealt with and why it's been dealt with in the way that it has.
Yeah, I mean, I see that a lot in my work, that quite often people just want an apology. It's just about that explanation and recognition that something went wrong. I think that's really important for people, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
And are you seeing more complaints now about accessibility issues?
Across the rail scheme, there has been an ever so slight increase noted in the data about accessibility claims. It's still not something that is a big driver of complaints, but it is an important category of complaint that we look at as an alternative, so people can make a choice about whether to pursue a complaint like this at the Ombudsman, or whether to go to court, or indeed to then go to court if they still haven't had the resolution that they're seeking through the Ombudsman. So that is an important place for these sorts of claims to be looked into as well.
What are the most common accessibility sort of issues that you get? Is I hear a lot about, people complaining about the toilets not working, for example.
Yeah, facilities is one aspect. Failed passenger assist as well might be another. So again, where somebody's maybe been embarked on a train and nobody's there to meet them to help them off the train at the other end. So that, again, those are the sorts of things we can look at, the services and facilities on board the train and at stations as well. So they are certainly things that we see as complaints.
What do you see rail companies doing to improve things, in accessibility terms?
In terms of information about what is or isn't available, is something that we see an appetite to be better of, to train staff so that they appreciate what people are experiencing and how that could potentially be disproportionately felt by people with accessibility needs. So that is something that we see in terms of the appetite for improving things. We have also made recommendations around passenger assist, people who have booked assistance having better contact when things go wrong, or when disruption occurs, and also to make sure that station information is up to date and reviewed so that people can make informed decisions about travel in accordance with the needs that they have. We've also made recommendations as well, and this is something that we've maybe seen a little bit more of around other people's behaviour, so antisocial behaviour that's experienced on trains, and how better to contact either relevant staff or maybe even British Transport Police, where that information is and what prominence is given to that information as well, so that people feel confident and comfortable when they're travelling.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important issue that we're hearing more about, aren't we, these days? I think there's sort of less staff around, people feeling less safe. But I think that, as you're saying, that it's who do you contact if you see some problematic behaviour, and you're on a packed train, what do you do?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the Rail Ombudsman's been going for 5 years now. So sort of statistic sort of terms wise, now do you see the number of complaints? You're receiving more complaints now as people begin to actually understand and know what the Rail Ombudsman is, and that there is one.
Yeah, I think there was a bit of a fluctuation during COVID because people weren't travelling. That if you look at the stats that we publish, that you will see that has had a an impact on the number of cases received. But I think we're back to a post-COVID more norm now in terms of that. So, for example, in 2022, our stats show we received 4,600 odd cases at the Rail Ombudsman. So more like what we would have expected to have seen without that interruption.
Mm-hmm. What are the sort of percentage of cases that you see in favour of the consumer against the provider, or where you come to a mutual decision, or what are your stats on that?
It's important here to note that we don't kind of benchmark or target around any of these stats. They are reported in the stats, and we run the figures when we run them, so we don't know where decisions are going to fall until we actually look at the data. But the latest annual review stats that we've got there, so we look at early resolution first. I think that's something, in terms of the process, we would be looking at trying to resolve everything as early as possible within the process, because that's better for everybody, so they can have an early resolution. So about 42% of the cases we accepted were closed down at an early stage. And then we moved to mediation. So it's really important to try to bring the parties back together, to try to look at an outcome that it maybe isn't a legal outcome, or it might be something that just settles it on that day for the parties. So our mediated outcomes there at 25% meant that the consumer had to be happy with what was offered by the rail service provider, because if they weren't, then they push that through to adjudication, where we make a formal decision. And 33% of our cases in that year were resolved at adjudication, with about 35% of those being upheld in favour of the passenger and 65% in favour of the rail company. So you've got mediation outcomes where the passenger, the consumer, is satisfied, and then you've got that a proportion of adjudication as well that's found in their favour.
So it's actually sort of higher than it might sound because of the first two stages.
Yeah.
What do you think are the myths that people have around sort of alternative dispute resolution, which an ombudsman is part of?
It's understanding process, isn't it? And understanding what we're here to do. So we are not a consumer champion. People can expect to have their case heard fairly and impartially. On the flip side of that, we're not a trade body either. So we're not on anybody's side within this dispute. We're looking at the evidence that we receive and coming to a decision based on that evidence from an objective, uninvolved, impartial standpoint. So I think that's one of the myths, the expectation that we are working for one or other party, when actually that's not what an ombudsman's there to do. It's there to resolve the dispute, to make a decision potentially that goes against one or other of the parties, but that's all done independently.
Yeah, I think it is a tricky one, because obviously, I've worked in this sort of area for sort of a few years, and I know that it can be very complicated for people just to even understand the basics. And it's just a case of educating people the whole time, isn't it? That the ombudsman is there, and it's always worth going because it's free to use. And that's always quite important to get across too, isn't it?
Free for consumers to use the ombudsman, and the decisions aren't binding on them either. So you can, as an individual, still take that via another channel or another route. If you've paid on the credit card, you could go via Section 75 of the Consumer Credit Act. You could go to court. So, you have got other options. But if you did go to court, for example, there's an expectation that you would have tried an alternative dispute resolution route like an ombudsman if one is available.
Talked a lot about rail. Tell me a little bit more about your furniture and home improvement ombudsman service.
That's been around for quite a number of years. Furniture Ombudsman originally set up in the early 90s, and it's an area where you potentially see quite a lot of potential for consumer detriment, thinking about big home improvement products or big ticket items that you don't necessarily spend money on every day when you go to the high street, or every week when you go and do your shopping. They are investments. And especially, if you're thinking about having a kitchen installation or a bathroom installation, they come with a fair amount of disruption as well as part of that. So we can look into disputes where the trader is registered as a business with us and subscribes to the scheme. So this is a voluntary sector, so slightly different to the previous one that we've been discussing in the rail, where that's mandated by license condition. In the furniture and home improvement sector, it is at the moment voluntary. So businesses subscribe to our code of practice and therefore are bound by our decisions. And again, it is just foremost an area of dispute resolution where people can come to have their cases heard and seek resolution. But also then we've got the broader Ombudsman remit to raise standards within that sector in our advice and training so that businesses get it right without consumers having to come via our Ombudsman in an ideal world.
Tell me a little bit more about how it was set up, because is it one of the longest standing or the longest standing Ombudsman service?
Yeah, I think that's right. In 1992 and set up because the then OFT said to the home improvement sector that we think you need to be doing something about this. So it was a call from the government to try to reduce the potential for consumer detriment. If you think about a home improvement project where consumers pay 100% up front and therefore might not have any leverage if things go wrong financially, it's to give that kind of comfort there that there is somewhere that they can go to have that dispute heard. And again, outside of the court system, against a whole backdrop at that time as well, when that was being looked at to try to stop cases going to court needlessly and reduce the pressures there as well.
What would you like to see in the whole sort of Ombudsman alternative dispute resolution sector? What changes would you like to see happen or improvements made?
I think this is a policy consideration. It's something that has been looked at over the last couple of years, and I know that's something that the Ministry of Justice is looking at again. I think having a single ombudsman in each sector would help things for consumers, make it more clear cut, and so that there's no proliferation and fragmentation in that market, but also having some really clear lines of communication and some public education around what their choices are and what the various options that they have in order to have the dispute heard. And I think that becomes easier if you did have mandated single ombudsman in each sector. And I think an ombudsman is an important mechanism because you have got that feedback back to the sector to help improve things there as well for everybody. One consumer's complaint could change a process that benefits so many other people. And I think that's where the ombudsman is slightly different. And I think a big piece of education for both the public and for businesses to understand the benefits of that, to understand how you could have a flexible remedy there that resolves things, that it could be looked at practically as well. So I think education for me is really important and has to go hand in hand with any changes that are made.
Yeah, absolutely. I would be with you on that. Do you think there should be the areas, I mean, it was talked about in the consumer bill, and it seems to have quietened down a bit, about thinking that certain sectors that should be mandatory?
There was talk about, as part of that initial consultation, about the home improvement sector. And I do appreciate the reasons why it was felt not now, in terms of, again, circling back to the COVID crisis, the pressure on businesses, but also the kind of the micro businesses, the small businesses, the sole traders, for example. So I understand the policy drivers around that. But as I say, I think the benefits need to be highlighted. And there are other ways of doing that. We have a number of trader endorsement or consumer code schemes that are part of our scheme. We do the ADR as a bolt-on to what they do. So a small trader can get the benefit of an ombudsman via that route as well. So these hurdles are not insurmountable. And I think that, again, it's highlighting the benefits for everybody, and for, the consumer can confidently place their contract in the hands of someone who can then confidently signpost to alternative dispute resolution, and nobody has to go to court. That's
quite a thing that gets overlooked, isn't it? Even if you do hear sort of ombudsman being talked about in the media, which isn't enough, when you do hear it talked about, it is about the benefits for the consumer, but very rarely is it talked about the value for businesses to join an ADR scheme. And I think, you touched on it there about how many benefits there are.
Apart from anything else, the business doesn't have to go to court either. And, that's really what this whole thing is about.
Yeah, there's a lot of prevention there, isn't there? That they might have to pay for a case to be heard. It's still going to be a lot less than going to court.
Absolutely. And in terms of time and investment and dealing with those complaints, if you don't have anywhere to signpost process wise, the consumer has to go to the trader first. They have to go to the business first, whatever sector you're in. So they have the opportunity to try to resolve that in-house. And then if they don't have anywhere to signpost to, how then do they deal with that, that frustration on both sides, really? At least at some point, it's 12 weeks in the furniture and home improvement Ombudsman. So they've got, because it's a physical, tangible product that's involved, so it might be slightly longer than some of the other ombudsmen. So they have 12 weeks to try to put that right, but they can say sooner, we've done everything we can here. So it's that horrible term deadlock, but that's how it's referred to. They can say to a consumer, we've done as much as we can here, so go to the Ombudsman. And that could be after 4 weeks or 5 weeks. It doesn't have to wait down the 12 weeks if they're at that stage, the parties are at that stage. So it's a benefit to both parties.
It's certainly a task to educate both businesses and consumers, isn't it? I think the whole ADR movement, sector, work, whatever you want to call it. Well, thank you very much for joining me. It's been really interesting, and I hope the listeners have found it useful too. But tell everybody where they can find you, please.
3 websites to look at. You've got railombudsman.org, disputeresolutionombudsman.org, and fhio.org, which is the Furniture and Home Improvement Ombudsman. We're on socials, so on LinkedIn or Twitter at Ombudsman Tweets. And if you Google Home Improvement Ombudsman or Rail Ombudsman, you'll get there that way as well.
Yes, so we will find you. Thank you very much, and thank you for listening. And if you have a topic you'd like me to discuss on the show, then you can email me on helen@eastlondonradio.org.uk. And you can find me on my website, thecomplainingcow.co.uk, for information on consumer issues, including rights and money-saving matters, and all the other episodes of the Complaining Cow Consumer Show on East London Radio. And you can find me on Twitter @ComplainingCow and @The Complaining Cow on Instagram and Facebook. And you can get 15% off my books, How to Complain, the Essential Consumer Guide to Getting Refunds, Redress and Results, and 101 Habits of an Effective Complainer, with the code ELRCOW. Many thanks. See you next time. Bye.